So now what we can do is introduce this concept called cycle. So inside of a for loop, we can actually cycle through things. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to go cycle and then say whatever I wanted here. Inside of this could be, we could close off the div. We could close off the row div. And then we could even create a brand new row div, which is going to give us some weird results. So let's just see what it looks like so you can see it. But it's cycling through those tags, and we want to do it maybe every third time. So each empty one here is an empty iteration. So on the first iteration, it's going to do this. Second and third, it'll be nice and empty. So we refresh, and that's what it looks like. Kind of odd, but let's just do it with something different, like an H1 and say hello there. Refresh, and now on the bottom of the every third one, it's actually going to show up. That's how cycle works. So we could do it on every other one, right? So every other one. So the first one, second one, third, and then so on. Cycle's kind of cool, but it's pretty much limited in what we want to do. So how do we do the same thing in a different way? Now, every for loop has something called a for loop counter. Really cool. We refresh in there, and it actually counts the iterations for us. It's built in, so we don't need to have some custom things for it. So now what we can do is say if for loop counter is divisible by 1, make sure there's no space there, or sorry, not divisible by 1, because every number is divisible by 1, then we're going to do something. Otherwise, we'll do something else. So I'll actually use a practical example, and that is creating a brand new div class row. So if we see in our for loop, every single for loop has a column, right? So it's its own column. So by default, we want that to be done. We want to close out the column no matter what. So in each iteration, no matter what, we want to close out that column. This just handles that, right? So if it's divisible by 2 or not, it closes out that div. That's it, right? But since we want to create a new row, what we have to do also is close out the row by closing out that div. That closes only this one when it's divisible by 2, and then we want to create a new row. That's it. So it's closing out the column, it's closing out the row, creates a new row, and then it runs through the iteration again. So we go ahead and save that, and we refresh, and what do you know? Our content is just a little bit different. If I inspect the element here, and of course, this seems to be related to Bootstrap, but it's actually not. It's templates related. The Bootstrap part just organizes it in a way to make it easy to read. So we see here that I have these two different rows. If I look inside of the inspect element here, here's the second row, here's the first row. Very cool. So I can even go one step further, is inside of here, I can add a div class of column 12. That is Bootstrap, I realize that, but I'm just going to add an HR tag. And this just adds a line inside of a column for me. I refresh and it shows me that line, right? So if I go look for it, we've got this new row here. There's the new line, and it actually separating the two rows for me, and it even does it down one further, right? So I could do this one step further and say, when it's divisible by 3. I refresh in here. What do you know? Now I have rows of 3. If it's divisible by 4, and so on. Right? When it's divisible by 4, it's actually not a clean row there, or at least how this is currently displayed, because we don't know that much about Bootstrap just yet. So I'm actually going to leave it at 3 and have it as a row just like that. When we come back and look at Bootstrap itself, this will allow us to see a little bit more of how we might go about changing the column and how it spreads and how it gets bigger and all that. But again, that's all Bootstrap related. This is about understanding a little bit more about how for loops work and how you can use this for loop counter to do all sorts of things. Of course, you can make other conditions in here, and you could say elif, as in else if it's divisible by, let's say, 2. We'll just add that in there. And again, same thing. Save it, refresh. that gives us a different result, right? So it's saying if it's divisible by 3, well, it's not divisible by 3. If it's divisible by 2, then do this. Otherwise, just close it out. So that means that it's creating a row after 2, it's creating a row after 3, and then it will repeat that going forward. So everything that's divisible by 3 is going to create a new row. Everything that's divisible by 2, it's going to create a new row. Although it hits this one first. So if it's divisible by 3 and 2, it's going to actually create this one first. But that's going to take some experimenting on your own. Now, how you would experiment with this is just by adding a ton of products to your actual product backend, right? Have a bunch of products in there, even if they don't have a whole lot to them. Playing around with this will help you understand this for loop counter a little bit more. This is not the same thing as doing pagination. So if you search Django pagination, there's a way to actually make multiple pages. It's not something we're going to cover right now, but it is something that you could look into. So, whenever you see a search result and you want to go to the next page, this is definitely different than that. You don't want to use a for loop counter for something like that. You would use something different for pagination. This, in my experience, has been a lot more for doing things just like this. Is just organizing the data in a different way. Now, I will say one big caveat with all of this is that Bootstrap itself offers a lot of great functionality for handling rows and columns and how it displays that information. All right, so if you have any questions on the for loop counter and a little bit more about for loops themselves, let us know. But I do recommend that you play around with this right now by adding those new products and then doing new conditions in here, including conditions like if object.title equals to something else, right? Doing conditions like that and just really playing around with how these templates work on your own and try to get a better understanding of how it works by tinkering and breaking things and then using the documentation for things you might not be aware of. Like we said before with the actual date filter. That's another thing that, once you play around with it a few times, you have a really good idea about how to do it. So hopefully you do those things and hopefully all this made sense. Otherwise, let's keep going.